After surviving a fall into the river that everyone insisted was just an accident, I moved in with my daughter's family to recover. But the very next morning, my granddaughter crept silently to my bedside and breathed into my ear, "Grandpa, you need to leave this house." I pressed her. "Why?" Without a word, she took my hand in both of hers, drew me across the room to the air vent set into the wall, and murmured, "Look." I bent down, peered into the darkness, and went rigid the instant I saw what was blinking back at me. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge, the place where real experience meets hard-earned wisdom, and the stories we tell are the ones that needed to be told. If these kinds of stories hit close to home for you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and give this one a like. It helps more people find their way here. And before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Has someone you loved and trusted ever turned out to be hiding a dangerous secret from you? Drop a yes or no in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know. Now, a brief note, some elements of this story have been dramatized for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals is purely coincidental. The truth at the heart of it, though, that part is very real. The Wilmington River doesn't merely flow, it devours. And as the cold current flooded my chest, I understood that the man I'd called son for 5 years had finally dropped the pretense of loving me. My name is Royce Callahan, a 68-year-old retired architect with a silver mane and eyes that still read the world in blueprints. I stood at the edge of the Wilmington River on that May morning in 2021 with no idea my life was about to be taken apart, piece by piece. I have always trusted the logic of structures. A sound foundation stays invisible until the storm arrives. I used to say that to my students back at the university, yet I had missed the rot spreading through my own walls. The River Street Promenade was my sanctuary, a place where the tide's steady rhythm against the stone gave my thoughts a predictable geometry. The humidity was already pressing down, a thick blanket reeking of salt and brackish marsh. Even so, I felt a quiet, strange peace. I watched the low morning sun spark off the water's surface, thinking of the drafting table, waiting at home, and the community center sketches still needing my hand. My life was a series of carefully drawn lines and reinforced concrete, or so I told myself. My knees carried the familiar ache of age, but my mind held steady, sharp as a laser level. Have you ever looked across the dinner table at someone and realized in a single cold flash that they were already sizing you for a casket? That thought only arrived when the shadow crossed my path. Dalton Stroud, 41, moved with the rehearsed ease of a hedge fund manager. His high-end cycling kit cut a sharp contrast against the morning mist as he came toward me, his father-in-law. He looked healthy, vigorous, and entirely wrong in the quiet of my morning walk. He smiled, but it was a structural facade, a veneer that never reached his calculating eyes. "You look tired, Royce," he said, his voice wrapped in a concern so manufactured it raised the hair on my neck. "Maybe these walks are getting to be a bit much for a man your age." I turned to face him, gripping the slick, rusted railing of the river walk. "I've never felt sharper, Dalton," I answered, keeping my voice as steady as a load-bearing beam. "Can you say the same for your fund?" I'd caught wind of his losses, the cracks spreading through his financial empire, but I hadn't anticipated the sudden shift in the atmosphere between us. His face set hard, the dutiful son-in-law mask slipping to expose the cold calculation underneath. Then came the shove. No warning, no words, just gravity and the betrayal of a hand I'd shaken 1,000 times. The railing gave, not from age but because it had been tampered with, the bolts worked loose by someone who knew my routine. I struck the water with a bone-jarring impact. The Wilmington River closed around me like an icy tomb, my waterlogged clothes dragging me down into the dark. Salt water seared my lungs like burning wire. I clawed for the surface, but the current pressed against me like a physical hand pushing me down into the silt. Just as the darkness began sealing shut, strong fingers seized my collar. Teo Navarro, a 28-year-old competitive swimmer with the lean, powerful build of an athlete in his prime, hauled me toward the muddy bank. He'd been in the middle of his morning training in the river, his compression tri-suit still dripping as he dragged me clear. "Stay with me, sir. Breathe." He called out, his voice urgent and commanding. I gasped, coughing the river out of myself, my vision dissolving into salt and light. Through the haze, I made out Dalton's silhouette up on the promenade above. He wasn't reaching for his phone. He was checking his watch. Teo glanced up at the promenade, his eyes narrowing as they found Dalton. "I saw him up there," Teo said quietly, his breath still heavy from the rescue. I saw someone close to you right before you went in. But Dalton was already moving phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying across the water in practiced panic. Help, my father-in-law fell. Please send an ambulance. The performance had begun, and I was too broken to speak the truth. The siren's wail sliced through the morning like a jagged blade, but it was the silence of the man standing above me that truly froze my blood. Dalton didn't run or hide after watching the river try to take me. Instead, he planted himself inside the rescue using his manufactured grief as a shield to control the story from the very first moment. I lay on the muddy bank, gasping at air that felt like liquid fire, while the paramedics scrambled down the slope toward us. My son-in-law stepped forward, his face folding into an Oscar-worthy performance of panic. "Oh God, Royce!" he cried, his voice pitched loud enough for every arriving responder to register. I turned my head. "How did you trip?" My throat was a raw cavern of salt and silt, and the metallic taste of blood coated my tongue I couldn't answer. Teo Navarro hovered near the gurney, his eyes sharp with a suspicion the police hadn't yet registered. "He didn't trip," Teo said firmly, pointing toward the promenade. "I saw someone near him." Dalton didn't miss a beat. He stepped directly into Teo's line of sight and waved a medic over. "Please, he's in shock." Dalton cut in his voice, saturated with synthetic grief. "Focus on his breathing. He's been so unsteady lately." I felt the scratch of a wool blanket being tucked around my seizing muscles as they lifted me onto the gurney. Powerless fury burned in my chest, but all I could do was watch Dalton steal my voice. Riding in that ambulance was like being buried alive in a box of neon light and sterile plastic with my would-be killer holding my hand. The floor vibrated through my skull in a steady thrum as the smell of ozone and rubbing alcohol filled the cramped space. Dalton leaned over me, his shadow cutting out the flickering overhead lights. "Save your strength, Dad." He murmured, his face inches from mine. "You're confused. Just breathe." I clawed at his arm, leaving faint red tracks across his expensive sleeve. "Dalton pushed," I managed to croak, but the word dissolved beneath the engine's hum and the medic's sudden report. "His vitals are erratic." The paramedic noted, reading my terror as a heart under stress. "Consider what it means. The only person the world trusts to save your life is the one who just tried to end it." When we reached Savannah Memorial Hospital, everything became a blur of harsh fluorescent light and sharp antiseptic. Dalton lingered at the admitting desk, seeding the poison before I'd even reached a bed. "He's 68. I heard him tell the nurse through the open trauma bay door. "But he's been acting much older lately. I was afraid something like this might happen." He was building a cage from the raw material of my own aging body, and the doctors were handing him the lock. As the curtain drew shut around me in that sea of sterile white, Dalton stepped into the trauma bay and leaned close. So close I could smell the expensive espresso on his breath. And for the first time, I saw the true monster living behind the tailored suit. "It's a long way down, Royce." He breathed, his voice as cold as river silt. "You should have stayed under." The heart monitor's steady rhythmic beep was a taunt, a digital metronome ticking down the seconds until my autonomy was officially declared dead. There is a particular terror in remaining sane, while the world around you is being quietly, professionally persuaded that your mind is a rotting structure. I lay pinned to the ER bed, the plastic ID band biting into my wrist, while Dalton stood at the foot of the gurney. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Dr. Orlin Cade, a neurologist with thin titanium frames and a voice as sterile as surgical steel, who studied my chart with the detached curiosity of a man examining a failing circuit board. Dalton's performance was masterful. "He's been forgetting names, doctor," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential, mournful register. "Last week he thought it was 1994. I think the river was just the breaking point." I tried to shout to tell the truth, but what came out was a raspy, erratic wheeze. "That's a lie." I managed to croak, my tongue thick and leaden from the sedative. "I remember the shove. I remember his hands." Dalton simply sighed, a sound of such profound patience that the doctor nodded in sympathy. "You see," Dalton murmured, "he's agitated, hallucinating. It's the shock." Dr. Cade stepped closer, trailing the smell of floor wax and recycled air on his lab coat. He never looked at the fear in my eyes. He was studying the dilation of my pupils. If a man loses his home, he's a victim. If he loses his mind, he's a burden. Which one do you suppose is easier to dispose of? As the doctor began a cognitive assessment, I understood the trap was already closing. "Royce, do you know who the president is?" he asked. I knew the answer, but the moment I opened my mouth, the room began to tilt. The fluorescent strips overhead smeared into long white streaks. "My head, it's spinning," I stammered. "Why won't anyone listen about Dalton?" The doctor made a notation on his tablet, a look of pity in his eyes that stung worse than the water, still sitting in my lungs. Royce understood then that the sedative the nurse had administered was no standard procedure. Dalton had whispered something to the staff about violent outbursts, making certain I'd be too medicated to defend myself during the evaluation. My memories had become like blueprints left in the rain ink running lines dissolving until the structure I once knew was gone. By the time the doctor left, I was drifting inside a chemical fog. Dalton lingered a moment, his tailored silhouette filling the doorway. "Sleep well, Dad," he said, and the lights were dimmed for my rest. I lay staring at the acoustic tiles above me, trying to reconstruct the morning with an architect's precision. I built skyscrapers that stood through hurricanes, I thought. So, how is it that I am the thing falling apart? I reached up to adjust my wristband fingers, fumbling at the plastic, when I felt something. A small, crumpled scrap of paper tucked beneath the edge of the band. I drew it out with trembling fingers and squinted at the messy scrawl. It wasn't from any doctor, it was from Sawyer. I'd seen him leave early. He didn't have his running shoes on. That note from my grandson was a thin lifeline threading through a sea of lies, but it confirmed the most terrifying truth of all. The hunt hadn't ended at the river. It had simply moved indoors. The thin scrap of paper stayed hidden in my palm, a raw edge of truth cutting through the chemical fog. Freedom typically arrives with a discharge paper, but as the orderly locked the brakes on my wheelchair, I understood I wasn't being released. I was being transferred to a different kind of custody. The antiseptic smell of the hospital had soaked into my clothes like a second skin, a reminder that the institutional walls meant to protect me had already failed. I watched my daughter Nadia Stroud, 40 years old, an interior designer whose life was as carefully curated as the room she now paced, look at me with a mixture of pity and concealed shame, her hands smoothing a silk scarf that probably cost more than my first drafting table. I insisted on calling a cab to my own historic home on Jones Street, but she dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "I built that house with my own hands, Nadia," I said, my voice still a raspy scrape. "I'm going home." "Dad, you almost drowned," she replied, her tone carrying a performed maternal concern that made my skin crawl. "The doctor says you're not tracking reality. You're coming to stay with us on Skidaway Island." It was then I spotted the folder in her bag, a legal document confirming she had already initiated a temporary emergency guardianship filing, using my disorientation as the primary weight to tip the scales. The hospital gown felt like a white flag. I was being forced to carry a surrender of every brick and beam I'd ever placed in this city. I wanted to shout that I was the architect of my own life, but the medication made my tongue feel like a waterlogged plank. Nadia helped me into her luxury SUV, the door closing with a soft, expensive thud that sealed me away from the world. As we left the hospital grounds, I watched the familiar streets of the city blur past through the stale, recycled air of the climate control. I reached into my pocket for my phone, needing to reach Teo Navarro, but what I pulled out was a useless slab of glass. The screen was shattered, the battery dead, conveniently overlooked by Dalton during the chaos of my admission. "Where's my phone, Nadia?" I asked, feeling the isolation settle into my bones. "It's broken, Dad," she said without glancing at me. "Dalton is getting it fixed. Just look at the scenery. Isn't it beautiful?" Have you ever noticed how the people who claim to love you most are the ones who know precisely which nerves to pinch to make you stop fighting? We crossed the Eugene Talmadge Memorial Bridge. The engine's vibration hummed through the seat as blinding sun bounced off the Savannah River below. I looked down at that water, the same water that had nearly taken me, and understood that crossing this river was moving me further from every witness to my life. Nadia's grip on the steering wheel had gone white-knuckled, her knuckles ghost pale against the leather. "You're shaking, Nadia," I said. "Is everything all right at home?" "Everything is perfect," she whispered, her voice pulled tight. "It has to be." As we turned into the driveway, a professional security van was just pulling away. Dalton had been busy. The gates of the Skidaway Island estate clicked shut behind us with a finality that sounded like a prison bolt sliding home. And there on the porch stood Dalton, waiting with a smile that never reached his eyes. The jasmine on Skidaway Island hangs thick enough to choke a man, a sweet cloying perfume, engineered to mask the smell of stagnant water and rot-filled secrets. As those heavy gates shut, I felt the physical weight of Dalton's hand land on my shoulder, a grip that was less about steadying me and more about staking a claim. He guided me up the stairs, past the elegant rooms Nadia had surely dressed with her curated precision, to a converted attic space on the third floor. "We thought you'd appreciate the privacy up here," Dalton said, his voice smooth as polished marble, away from the noise of the kids. I scanned the room, my architect's eye cataloging the modifications at once. Privacy, Dalton, or just a clear line of sight for those lenses in the crown molding? I asked, gesturing toward the discreet high-resolution cameras nestled in the woodwork. He didn't blink. He simply set my bag on a sparse, clean chair that smelled of fresh paint. The chemical tang was sharp, a specific industrial solvent used to strip old lead, which was strange for a new build. It caught at the back of my throat, a physical trigger designed to produce the very headaches and confusion he intended to document. I stood on the cold, polished hardwood and felt the house constricting around me like a well-engineered trap. Dalton's hospitality was a velvet glove over brass knuckles. It appeared soft, but every time his hand found my shoulder, I felt the bone-deep bruise of his intentions. "We value routine in this house, Dad," he told me later at the dinner table. "It helps keep everyone focused." I looked at the oversalted, expensive rack of lamb on my plate, then at my grandchildren. Sawyer Stroud, a lanky 12-year-old carrying my own sharp gaze, sat with a posture so rigid it looked painful, his eyes darting toward the security sensors mounted in the corners. Beside him, 8-year-old Celia Stroud clutched her fork, watching her father with eyes that absorbed far more than any child ever should. Focused on what Dalton... I asked, my voice steady, despite the chemical haze beginning to cloud my thoughts. "The next quarterly report or the next accident?" Nadia looked away. Her silence was a load-bearing wall propping up Dalton's ego. The tension was an audible hum, rivaled only by the high-efficiency HVAC system, pushing that tainted air through every vent. Then I saw it, the hole where the lock should be a void in the wood, that told me I was no longer a guest but a specimen. After dinner, Dalton intercepted me in the upper hallway and pressed a printed itinerary into my hands. It listed cognitive exercises and mandatory rest periods like a prison schedule. "It's for your own safety, Royce," he said, his smile as fixed and hollow as ever. "In case you wander during one of your episodes." He gestured toward my door, where the lock had been removed and replaced with a simple latch that could only be engaged from the outside. I stepped into my room, the hallway cameras clicking as they adjusted their focus, trailing me like a persistent insect. As I moved to close the door, I caught a glimpse of Celia in the shadows of the nursery wing. She didn't wave or speak. She simply pressed a single finger to her lips and pointed toward the ventilation grate in my ceiling. I looked at the grate she had indicated, its metal slats humming with the central air, and understood I wasn't merely being watched. I was being listened to. The nightmare didn't end when I opened my eyes. It had only swapped the black water of the Wilmington River for the smothering silence of a house that was trying to kill me. I lay awake in that third-floor attic room, my lungs still feeling weighted, as if the river silt had never fully drained from them. Above me, the ventilation grate hummed with a low, steady vibration, a rhythmic pulse I soon recognized as far too uniform for any standard HVAC system. As an architect, I understood the acoustic signature of a home like this, and it didn't take long to realize that hum was a white noise generator. A clever structural addition designed to bury the sounds of Dalton and Nadia moving through the floors below while they finalized whatever plan required my quiet disappearance. The chemical smell seeping from the walls, that sharp industrial solvent bite, grew heavier in the humid midnight air. It made my head pound and my thoughts splinter into jagged pieces exactly the way Dalton intended. I forced myself to hold on. Walls don't just speak, Royce. I breathed into the empty room. They record. I reconstructed the house's layout in my mind, tracing ductwork and reinforced floorboards, hunting for a weakness in the cage. A faint metallic click came from the door, the latch lifting from the outside. I went rigid, my heart hammering against my ribs as a small figure slipped through into the room, silhouetted in pale moonlight. Sawyer. His frame looked fragile and trembling as he clutched a small electronic device, moving toward my bedside with a ghostly stillness. "Grandpa, don't make a sound." He breathed, his voice so low it nearly dissolved into the white noise. "The vents. He can hear your breathing, Sawyer." "What are you doing here?" I asked, reaching out to touch his arm. "You're shaking, son?" He didn't answer, just closed his fingers around my hand, and they felt like ice. "You need to see the papers," he pressed. "He thinks you're too far gone to notice, but he's stripping out everything. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that the man who gave him his surname is the same man trying to erase yours?" I had no words for it, so I simply followed him. Sawyer led me out of the room, navigating the shadows with a terrifying precision. He knew exactly which floorboards to step around so as not to trip the sensors Dalton had installed. We worked our way down to the second floor, the deep rhythmic tick of an antique long-case clock in the foyer marking the time like a second heartbeat. We stopped before a heavy mahogany door that Dalton kept triple locked. Sawyer produced a key he'd lifted from Dalton's gym bag and eased it into the lock. It turned, a cold, weighty sound, like a vault opening, or a grave. "He's in the office every night until 4:00, Sawyer whispered. "We've got 20 minutes. As he pushed the door inward, something stopped my blood cold, colder than the river. Sawyer was wearing his running shoes, the neon-trimmed pair Dalton had claimed he was wearing on his own run that morning. My grandson hadn't merely heard about the accident. He had been there. He had seen the push. Sawyer's hand tightened around my knuckles, white as the door swung open to reveal a room swimming in the blue sick glow of 3 computer monitors and a desk buried under files stamped with my name. Stepping into that office felt like walking into a crime scene that hadn't officially happened yet. A room where my entire existence had been reduced to spreadsheets and cold, calculated risk. The smell of stale single-origin pour-over and the sight of a folder labeled with my social security number greeted me as the door clicked shut behind Sawyer and me. Almost immediately, I understood that the contingency folder sitting on top had been assembled 6 months ago. Proof that the river incident was no sudden impulse, but a long-term strategy meticulously drafted by the man my daughter called her husband. The office sat in that same sickly blue light, reflecting off 3 massive monitors, the glow sliding across Sawyer's thin titanium frames as he watched the door. A hard drive whirred in the background, a mechanical pulse in a room full of digital shadows. On those screens, I saw the true shape of Dalton's world. He was logged into a private server for his hedge fund, but the charts weren't climbing. Red alert graphs filled the displays, a total collapse of investor capital, a bleeding crimson line that cut sharply against the face of success he projected at the dinner table. Sawyer pointed to a specific physical drawer beneath the heavy mahogany desk, one reinforced with steel, conspicuously out of place in a modern home office. "He spends hours here." "Grandpa," Sawyer whispered, his voice trembling, "he doesn't look at stocks. He looks at this." I studied the cascading losses on the screen and shook my head. "Those numbers are hemorrhaging, Sawyer. This isn't a fund. It's a furnace." I reached for the drawer, the metal cold beneath my fingers. Going through these files felt like reading my own autopsy, with my heart still beating. I pulled out a thick leather-bound folder that felt unnecessarily heavy. It wasn't a business file. It was an archive of my life. Inside, the dry, papery scent of old blueprints filled the tight space. "Why does he have my blueprints from 1984? I asked, leafing through original drafts of the city library I'd designed decades ago. "He says he's protecting the family's assets," Sawyer said. "But he's been selling things, hasn't he?" I let the question go, unanswered my eyes, dropping to a red folder at the very bottom of the drawer. It was labeled Royce Callahan Contingency Phase 2. How much is a life worth in a falling market? For Dalton, the answer was exactly $3.5 million. My hands shook as I opened it to find a printed draft of a massive life insurance policy listing Dalton Stroud as the sole beneficiary. Beneath it lay a forged power of attorney, the ink mocking me with its professional precision. "This isn't my signature," I whispered. "I never signed this." My eyes found the notary seal at the bottom, and the air left my lungs. The name Gideon Stroud was embossed in gold foil. I registered the date. It had been notarized the day before my wife Vivian's funeral, while I was too deep in grief to notice that Dalton had slipped away from the house for an hour. I stared at the name Gideon Stroud on that seal, and a cold memory surfaced. A man I'd seen Nadia speaking to at the hospital. A man who was no doctor. The structure of my family hadn't merely cracked. It had been rigged for a controlled demolition. The memory of the man Nadia had spoken to at the hospital, Gideon Stroud, sent a chill through me that the office air conditioning couldn't account for. Gideon Stroud, 52, carried the stillness of a maritime lawyer who knew exactly where the bodies were buried and precisely how to keep them there. Have you ever found the price tag for your own murder tucked among the family photos? I dug deeper into the contingency folder, while Sawyer stood, watch his eyes cutting toward the office door. The $3.5 million policy wasn't just a document, it was a blueprint for my liquidation. I traced the premium payments and found they were being routed through a shell company tied directly to Dalton's failing fund. The accidental drowning rider would double the payout, a detail that turned my stomach inside out. "Grandpa, look at the dates," Sawyer whispered, his voice cracking. "These withdrawals, they started the month Mom and Dad bought this house." I stared at a secondary ledger Sawyer had lifted from the stack. My daughter Nadia hadn't been a passive bystander. Her signature appeared on several withdrawal slips drawn from my private retirement accounts, totaling nearly $500,000. They didn't just want me dead, Sawyer. They'd already started consuming my ghost. The betrayal was a structural failure, a load-bearing wall of my life giving way in real time. My rage ran cold and precise, an architect's fury at a sabotaged design. I turned the page and found something even more sinister, a structural survey of the Wilmington River promenade railing. 180 urlabs, the exact measure of a man's life when priced by his son-in-law. The report flagged a section where the bolts had been corroded with acid engineered to give way under my precise weight. I recognized the architectural notations penciled in the margin, the careful sloping hand of someone who had used my own drafting instruments to plan my execution. He used my own formulas to calculate my death. I whispered, the paper crackling under my white-knuckle grip. "Don't ever assume your family won't kill you. Sometimes they just haven't seen the right balance sheet yet." The smell of ozone rising from the computer towers seemed to sharpen as I reached into the back of the drawer frame. My fingers found a small, high-end digital recorder tucked behind the wood. I switched it on, the tiny rhythmic click landing like a heartbeat in the silence. What I heard was my own voice from the hospital, but twisted. Heavily edited, my words spliced and stitched until I sounded unhinged and combative. Dalton had been engineering the evidence for my competency hearing, carving up my speech, until I came across as a man who had lost all purchase on reality. "That's not what I said," I told Sawyer, my eyes burning. He's cutting the words out. I scrolled to the bottom of the digital files and found one dated months before the river. It was titled, "Trial Run." My heart stopped. This wasn't the first time they'd tried. "Grandpa, the light on the door. Someone's coming." Sawyer hissed, his hand closing on my shoulder. The red laser of the security sensor on the door frame blinked suddenly green, and the heavy thud of a footstep echoed in the hallway just outside. I shoved the recorder into my pocket, cold sweat prickling at my hairline, as a man's shadow fell across the frosted glass of the office door. Shadows don't just hide secrets, they breathe. And as the floorboard outside the office groaned, I understood that the man who wanted my life was only inches from ending it. The heavy thud of those footsteps behind the mahogany door sent a bolt of adrenaline through my aged frame. I seized Sawyer by the shoulder, my fingers pressing into his thin shirt, and hauled him toward the knee-hole of the massive desk. We folded ourselves into that narrow space, pulling our legs tight against the cold, unyielding wood as the handle turned with a sharp metallic click. The office door swung wide, and the room filled at once with the heavy, cloying drift of expensive bourbon and fresh mint. Dalton moved into the room, the beat of his dress shoes on the floor ticking like a countdown. He left the overhead lights off, relying on the blue flickering wash of the computer monitors, which painted the dark walls like a digital haunting. I held my breath, lungs scorching from the effort, as his silhouette settled directly above our hiding spot. "Don't breathe, Sawyer," I mouthed in a voice so faint it was barely a thought. "Just be a shadow." I could make out a sharp, rhythmic thudding that I told myself was Dalton's heart, though it was almost certainly just the blood hammering through my own ears. He reached for the mouse, the clicking loud in the absolute silence. "Just a few more days, Royce." I heard him murmur to the empty air, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "Then we can finally balance the books." He checked a single notification on the screen, his fingers tapping a restless beat on the desk surface inches from my head, then turned and left as quickly as he had come. The door closed, and the lock engaged with a finality that sealed us in darkness. "You think you know your family? You think blood is a bond, but in this house, blood was just the ink used to sign my death warrant." Once the sound of his footsteps faded down the hall, I crawled out, my hands shaking. My palm grazed a hidden latch set into the back of the desk drawer, a structural secret I'd never noticed before. I pressed it, and a secondary compartment slid open. What lay inside was a ghost gallery. I stared at surveillance photos of two other women, Dorothea Alcott of Charleston and Beverly Crane of Atlanta. Taped to the back of the dry, papery death certificates were news clippings about tragic accidents involving water. He didn't just target me, Sawyer. I whispered, holding the photos out to him. This is a trophy room. My stomach turned when I reached the final detail, 3 gold wedding rings nestled in a velvet-lined corner of the drawer. He kept them like architectural souvenirs. Grandpa, those ladies. Sawyer said, his voice small and hollow. They look like they're sleeping in the water. The realization landed harder than the river had. I wasn't just a victim. I was a project, the third building in a skyline of corpses. I picked up the digital recorder once more and understood that the file labeled trial run was no rehearsal of my death. It was a recording of Dorothea Alcott's final gasping moments. Sawyer guided me out of the office, his young face hardened by what we had uncovered. We moved through the dark hallway back to the 3rd floor, every creak sounding like an alarm. I sank onto my bed, the full weight of the discovery pressing down on me. Go to bed, Sawyer. Lock your door. From now on, we play the part he wants. As the first gray light of dawn touched the window, I heard Dalton's voice from the hallway, bright and loud, calling me down for breakfast, as though he hadn't just loomed above our hiding spot with the soul of a reaper. Looking into the mirror that morning, I didn't see an architect. I saw an actor preparing for the most dangerous opening night of his life, one where a single missed cue would mean a permanent curtain call. I deliberately chose mismatched socks and left my collar askew to reinforce the image of a man losing his grip on detail. I practiced a vacant, faintly confused expression in the glass, letting my jaw slacken just enough to look beaten. From below came the cheerful sounds of a family breakfast. Nadia humming a soft tune, the distant muffled laughter of Celia. But to my ears, it sounded like a curated stage play engineered by a predator. Just a confused old man, Royce, I whispered to my reflection. Be the victim they want to see. As I descended the stairs, the antique long-case clock in the foyer ticked like a heart monitor marking each step. I walked into the dining room, where the scent of heavy, humid gardenias drifted through the open window, a cloying floral smell too thick for the morning air. Nadia was setting out bowls of expensive hothouse figs, their dark syrup pooling against the white porcelain. I recognized then that the fruit was laced with the same chemical irritant from the room paint, an overly sweet chemical aftertaste clinging to the edges of the flavor. It was a subtle toxin designed to induce the very fogginess Dalton was so keen to document. Dalton sat at the head of the table, his perfectly manicured nails tapping a restless rhythm against the wood as he skimmed a digital paper. He greeted me in a cheerful tone that bore no relation to the cold thud of the footsteps I had heard outside his office hours before. "Did you hear the house settling last night?" "Royce?" he asked, eyes never leaving the screen. I thought I heard footsteps on the 2nd floor around 3D0. I paused, letting a flicker of faux panic move across my face as I lowered myself into my chair. I had a dream about the River Dalton. I think I got up for water, but I couldn't find the kitchen. The stairs, they keep moving on me. Have you ever sat across from your own flesh and blood and watched them wait for you to fail, like vultures circling a dying animal in a $5,000 dining room? Across from me, Sawyer sat rigidly, barely touching his food, his eyes fixed on his plate so as not to betray our shared secret. Dalton leaned in, testing me. "Remember, we talked about selling your drafting table yesterday, Dad? You agreed it was just taking up space. A lie, a fictional conversation from a day that never happened." "Did I asked, my voice thin. "Yes. I suppose everything is taking up space lately." I caught the triumphant glint in his eyes, a hunter who believed his prey was finally cornered. He was recording me every stutter, every staged lapse. I was building his case with every breath. As Dalton rose to leave for work, he passed Nadia a small digital device I recognized immediately. It was the recorder from the office, and it was already running, capturing my every confused word. He paused at the door, hand on the frame, and looked back at me with an expression of predatory pity that made my skin crawl. "Don't worry, Royce. We're going to get you the help you need today. Real help." I closed the bedroom door and leaned against it. The tremor in my hands staged in the dining room turned genuine as the adrenaline began to drain away. The silence of the attic room pressed against my ears like a physical weight, broken only by the faint hum of the white noise generator. I crossed to the window and drew the heavy curtain back, just enough to watch Dalton's luxury SUV vanish down the driveway. I understood then that the care plan Nadia had mentioned wasn't limited to my health. It included a provision for Dalton to begin the immediate liquidation of my firm's intellectual property. "They've built the Cage Royce," I whispered to the empty room. "Now you have to find the one loose bolt." I began at once a mental structural inventory of my circumstances, pulling apart the morning's performance the way an architect dismantles a flawed blueprint. I had the evidence from the office, but I was physically stranded on the third floor, and legally being hemmed in by the cognitive specialist Dalton was hauling over. The sight of dust motes drifting through the morning light felt like a taunt aimed at my captivity. I reached into the hidden compartment of my suitcase and withdrew a small velvet pouch. The faint cedar scent from the trunk where it usually lived still clung to the fabric. I drew out Vivian's wedding ring, the cool, smooth weight of the gold settling like an anchor in my trembling palm. Grief is a heavy stone, but if you hold it right, it becomes a weapon. I turned the band slowly between my fingers, remembering the 45 years we had spent building a life together in this city we called home. This ring stood for more than love. It was the physical anchor of the integrity Dalton was working to strip from me. "I promised you I'd look after her, Vivian," I muttered, my voice fracturing. "But how do I save a daughter who's helping the man holding the knife I thought back to the values we had planted in Nadia, and the crushing guilt of failing to recognize Dalton's predatory nature sooner threatened to pull me under. He isn't just taking my money. He's dismantling the legacy I spent decades constructing. You never know the true strength of a structure until someone tries to tear it down. Dalton was about to discover exactly how deep my pilings went. I understood then that my foundation was still solid, far stronger than the hollow greed he was built upon. I moved to replace the ring, but my fingers grazed something else at the bottom of the velvet pouch. Tucked inside, I found a small handwritten note from Vivian, written not long before she died. "Don't let our daughter lose her way in the shadows," it read. My heart stopped. She had sensed something about Dalton even then, a mother's intuition catching the rot before the architect noticed the cracks. I folded the note away, my eyes sharpening with a clarity that the sedative fruit couldn't reach. "A building only falls if the foundation is weak," I told the shadows. "Mine isn't." I straightened my shirt, the tremor leaving my hands as a cold, calculating resolve moved in to replace it. The sharp, rhythmic knock at my door wasn't Sawyer's gentle tap. It was the heavy, assured rap of someone who believed they already owned the room I was standing in. The metallic click of the latch rang out like a hammer strike, marking the end of my brief peace. My daughter didn't enter the room as a child coming to her father. She entered as a surveyor assessing a condemned building, her eyes mapping the cracks she was certain were forming in my mind. The groan of the door hinges as Nadia stepped into the space she had helped convert into a prison resonated through my chest. She was carrying a small tea tray, the porcelain cups chattering a nervous rhythm against the wood. Her voice carried a rehearsed clinical warmth that smelled of lavender and antiseptic, a stark contrast to the genuine tenderness she had once possessed. "Dad, we know you miss Mom," she said, setting the tray down with practiced care. "But you're seeing things that aren't there. You're scaring the children." As she poured the tea, a manila envelope slipped from her designer bag and dropped to the floor. I caught a glimpse of its contents before she snatched it back, glossy photographs of two women I had never met smiling at charity galas and yacht clubs. On the back of one photo, a handwritten note in an unfamiliar hand read, "They trusted him too." Nadia's face drained of color as she shoved the envelope back into her bag. "It's nothing, Dad, just old client files." But her hands were shaking so badly the teacup rattled against the saucer. Someone was trying to warn her, and she was either too frightened or too entangled to hear it. I sat upright, Vivian's note still a hot coal in my pocket. "I miss her every second, Nadia, but grief doesn't make a man hallucinate a hand on his back in the river." She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes glistening with a pity that felt like a burial. She began speaking about the strain I had carried since Vivian's death in 2019, gently suggesting that my mourning had curdled into a permanent cognitive break. I understood in that moment that she was simply reciting Dalton's carefully constructed talking points, serving as the soft edge of the blade meant to sever me from my own life. "Do you know what it feels like to have your love for your dead wife used as a lock on your prison door? It is a singular kind of agony to watch your own child weaponize your widowhood." As she poured the tea, The sleeve of her silk blouse rode back, revealing a new sapphire bezel watch. I recognized the design immediately from the credit card statements I had found in Dalton's office, glittering blood money drawn from my own retirement account. Nadia caught my gaze and quickly tugged her sleeve down. She raised a family brunch from 6 months ago that I had supposedly forgotten to attend, wielding it as evidence of my accelerating decline. I saw then that they had been keeping a meticulous record of every minor slip I had made, while grieving assembling a case for my incompetence long before the push into the river. "Dalton says it's complex bereavement disorder," she whispered. "He's just trying to protect your legacy." "Is that what we're calling it now?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the hammering of my pulse. "Protecting a legacy by putting the legatee in a cage." She was the drywall over the rot, beautiful, seamless, and completely complicit in the structural failure of our family. The antique long-case clock in the foyer downstairs ticked a heavy mocking beat that swelled to fill the silence. Nadia told me a cognitive specialist would arrive within the hour and that I needed to cooperate for everyone's sake. "Just tell the doctor the truth, Dad. Tell him how tired you are." As she turned to leave, she reached for the velvet pouch on the nightstand. "I'll keep this safe so you don't misplace it again," she said. I watched her go, my heart hardening into a diamond of resolve. As the door latched shut, I noticed she had left behind a printed document on the chair. I picked up the forgotten symptom log, my eyes moving across notes written in Gideon Stroud's handwriting. Triggers: Vivian the firm, the river. Aim for high agitation. The psychological warfare had entered its final phase, and the enemy was already inside the walls. The brisk professional footsteps on the porch announced the arrival of someone who intended to finish what the river had begun. But for now, I had other ruins to inspect. I pocketed the symptom log, the paper cold as a stone against my thigh, and made my way down to the kitchen. The room was bright humming, with the cheerful drone of a Sub-Zero refrigerator and the rich aroma of single-origin pour-over. But standing in the doorway, I saw it plainly, a theater of theft, and my own daughter was the lead actress. Nadia was busy sorting through a delivery of artisanal groceries, her movements clipped and jagged. Inside a heavy Italian cookbook, I spotted a stack of past due notices for the children's private school tuition, the red ink standing out against the white paper like a fresh wound. It seemed the financial collapse was nearer than even Dalton's office files had implied. I watched her for a moment, taking in the designer shoes she tried to tuck behind the marble island and the new espresso machine that likely cost more than my first car. Her materialism had made her the perfect clay for Dalton to shape into a criminal accomplice. "That is a lot of groceries for 4 people. "Nadia," I said, my voice shedding its confused veneer. "Dalton's fund must be doing better than the news suggests." She startled, her heels clattering against the polished floor. "We just like quality, Dad. Don't worry about the receipts." I crossed to the marble countertop, its surface cool and smooth beneath my fingers. "I saw the statements in the office, Nadia. $400,000 in credit card debt. Is that why you notarized those papers at the hospital?" She froze her face, turning a sickly translucent pale. "You were snooping. How dare you? You are supposed to be resting, not playing spy in my own home." She was a structure under immense stress, the load-bearing walls of her conscience bowing beneath a lifestyle she could no longer afford. I dropped the act entirely, my voice returning to that of the authoritative architect. "Do you truly trust him, Nadia? Or are you just too afraid of the debt to look him in the eye?" My heart broke for her. Yet I couldn't ignore the rot. How many dinners can you buy with your father's soul before the taste of the food turns to ash in your mouth? Nadia exploded, then a defensive rant fueled by desperation. "You are being paranoid," she screamed, wielding the very language from Gideon Stroud's notes like a shield against the truth. "You're delusional. I'm calling Dalton. You're clearly having another episode and need to get upstairs." She raked the groceries into the sink with a frantic, almost violent energy and fled the room. As she went, her phone tumbled from her pocket and skidded across the marble. It landed face up the screen, blazing to life with a text from Dalton. I leaned in, eyes narrowing as I read, "Is the old man quiet, yet Webb says we need the signature by Friday or the house is gone." I stood alone in the cold brightness of that kitchen. The refrigerator's hum, the only thing left in the world. The text on Nadia's screen went dark, but the words, "or the house is gone," stayed burned behind my eyes. They weren't just killing me for profit. They were killing me for survival. Survival isn't only about outrunning a predator, it's about understanding the architecture of his past kills. And when Sawyer slipped me a thin, worn envelope in the hallway, I knew the blueprints of my own destruction had finally come within reach. The click of the front latch earlier had told me Nadia had retreated to the garden, but it was Sawyer's shadow in the service hallway that delivered the real evidence. He stood there, chest heaving, his young face set in a mask of protective urgency no child should ever have to wear. He was going to throw these away, Sawyer whispered, his voice barely rising above the low hum of the house. I found them in the trash bag in his car. He pressed the envelope into my hands. The first thing I pulled out was a dry cleaning receipt, crinkling in my trembling fingers. It was for a suit Dalton had worn the day of my accident, marked with urgent notes about river mud and salt stains, despite his sworn statement to police that he had never gone near the water. "You're a brave man, Sawyer," I said, tucking the paper into my pocket. "Go play in the yard now. Don't let them see you near me." I withdrew to a dim corner of the living room, the humid air of the hallway still pressing against my skin like something alive and hostile. I opened my laptop, its blue light cutting through the dark room, and began a focused search on the names I'd found in his office, Dorothea Alcott and Beverly Crane. Looking for these women was like scrolling through a catalog of ghosts, each one a structural failure in Dalton's soul that he'd plastered over with stolen money. The digital obituaries surfaced one by one, chilling in how closely they resembled each other. Dorothea had died in a Charleston boating accident in 2014. Beverly had drowned in a private pool in Atlanta in 2017. Both were wealthy. Both had been recently married to a man operating under a slightly different alias. But the photographs Sawyer had recovered matched the digital portraits exactly. Boating accident, private pool, Wilmington River. Water is his signature, I whispered to the empty room. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I began cross-referencing those dates against what I knew of Dalton's financial history. His boutique fund had taken its first major loss in 2013, just months before Dorothea's death. A second massive shortfall hit in 2016, leading straight to Beverly's unfortunate accident. If the water always came for them when the accounts ran dry, what did that mean for me? A man whose house was already being measured for its final sale. The current shortfall stood at $3.1 million, a debt so deep that my own end-of-life timeline had been pushed to meet a hard Friday deadline. He's not just a killer, he's an actuary of murder. I'm the third quarter dividend. A visceral disgust moved through me as I grasped that I was nothing more than a line item on a balance sheet. I scrolled further down Beverly Crane's page and found one last haunting detail. Her obituary mentioned a surviving stepson who had disappeared after the inheritance was settled. A pattern of total erasure. I was still staring at Beverly's smiling face on the screen when the sharp, rhythmic rattle of the front door handle shattered the silence. Dalton's silhouette filled the frosted glass, blocking out the afternoon sun, and for one suspended second, the world held perfectly still. The laptop screen felt like a beacon in that dim room, a glowing confession of my lucidity that I had exactly 3 seconds to extinguish before my executioner stepped through the door. The heavy front door thudded open, followed by Dalton's chillingly calm voice calling my name. With a sharp click, I slammed the lid shut, the heat radiating from the laptop's underside, pressing into my palm like a brand. I dropped back into the armchair at once, fixing my gaze on a nearby floor lamp, with the vacant glassy stare I had rehearsed in the mirror. Dalton came around the corner, his presence filling the room with a cold, authoritative weight. He didn't speak immediately. He walked straight to the coffee table and rested his hand on the laptop lid. "The laptop is warm, Royce," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I thought you were napping." I let my jaw go slack, manufacturing the dry, sticky feeling in my throat. "I was looking for the blueprints of the St. Jude steeple," I said, my voice thin and unsteady. "The one with the copper cap. Do you have the copper, Dalton? We need it for the foundation." He regarded me with a blend of suspicion and a deepening predatory patience. His voice was like sandpaper drawn across fine mahogany grating, ruinous, committed to stripping away every layer of my dignity until nothing remained but raw, exposed grain. "Nadia says you were shouting about money in the kitchen," he said, circling my chair the way a wolf circles. "That's not like you, Royce. Sounds like agitated paranoia." I looked back at him, blinking slowly. "Money?" I asked, tilting my head. I was asking about the gardenias," They smell like the hospital, don't they? Only then did I understand he wasn't guessing. He had a remote access app on that laptop. He had watched my search history into Dorothea and Beverly in real time. That was why he was home early. He wasn't here to check on me. He was here to accelerate the end. A luxury sedan crunched across the gravel drive and pulled up to the house a full hour ahead of the scheduled appointment. Have you ever seen your own death warrant being unloaded from a stranger's trunk, dressed up as a real estate sign? I watched through the window as a man in a charcoal suit lifted out a for sale sign, its sharp metal stakes catching the afternoon light. The house was already going to market, and I hadn't even been declared incompetent yet. "The doctor is early," Dalton said, his smile sharpening into something lethal. "He's a private consultant recommended by Gideon Stroud. He's very thorough, Royce. He'll see right through the foundations." Through the glass, I watched a second man in a navy blazer climb out of the sedan and pull a heavy wooden stake from the trunk. It was not medical equipment. It was a real estate sign. The polished placard read, "Historic Savannah. Property coming soon," with a glossy photograph of my Jones Street home. Dalton was already marketing my house, liquidating my life, before the ink on any competency papers had dried. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He hadn't just planned my death. He'd already spent the inheritance. The sign's metal stakes glinted in the afternoon sun like grave markers, a visual countdown to the moment I would be declared legally dead while still breathing. A surge of panic-driven adrenaline moved through me. The dry cleaning receipt was still in my pocket, and if the consultant searched me, it would destroy everything. I had to pivot, and I had to do it now. The smell of expensive leather and rain on the consultant's coat seemed to reach the room even before the man himself did. Dalton's hand clamped onto my elbow, with the grip of a vice steering me toward the study. "Time for your checkup, Royce. Try to be coherent. Your future depends on it." I let myself be led, my mind racing for somewhere to hide the truth, while my body played the part of a crumbling ruin. The study door clicked shut with the finality of a prison bolt, and I found myself staring into the cold, clinical eyes of a man whose purpose was to dismantle my life with a clipboard. I sat in the high-backed leather chair, the dry scent of old bindings and fresh printing ink heavy in the air, while Dalton stood behind me like a warden. Dr. Burl Hext was introduced to me as a man who wore his medical credentials like a loaded weapon, the suit on his back worth more than a year of my retirement checks, and he watched me with the unmoving patience of something that circles before it lands. My heart was a fist hammering against my ribs, but I kept my face slack, unreadable. Within the first minutes of that evaluation, I noticed the sapphire bezel watch on Hext's wrist. Exclusive merchandise from Dalton's own hedge fund line, a quiet confession that he was no impartial consultant. He was Dalton's man, top to bottom. "Royce, can you tell me what you were looking for on the laptop this afternoon?" "En baba iti speaks post natwaska." The voice was smooth, calibrated, dangerous. I sank deeper into my role, letting a dry, rasping cough crawl up my throat. "Blueprints," I murmured, drifting my gaze toward the window. "Old Savannah is built on such shaky pilings, don't you think?" He ran me through a battery of standard cognitive assessments, but the questions weren't standard at all. They were engineered to trip the wires of the agitated paranoia Gideon Stroud had cataloged in my symptom log. Every time his thumb pressed a button on his tablet, I felt the room contract. During a physical coordination test, I had to shift my jacket, and the mud-streaked dry cleaning receipt Sawyer had slipped me nearly escaped from the pocket. A cold bolt of adrenaline shot through me as I managed to nudge the paper beneath the heavy mahogany desk just before Hext leaned in close. He wasn't diagnosing me. He was measuring the height of the walls he was being paid to build around my remaining days. The cold disc of his stethoscope on my chest felt like a probe searching for a weakness to exploit. "Your eyes are quite bloodshot, Royce." His face was inches from mine. "Are you having trouble sleeping in this new house?" I knew exactly what he was hunting for. Traces of the chemical sedation Nadia had been folding into my food. "The paint," I rambled, letting my eyes wander the ceiling. "It has a very specific weight to it. How do you fight a man who is paid to believe you're out of your mind? You don't. You let him believe he's already won." I watched that watch ticking on his wrist, a countdown I couldn't afford to ignore. Dalton broke in, then face glowing with that smug, toxic satisfaction he could never quite contain, announcing dinner like a man presiding over his own victory banquet. "The foundations are worse than we thought," Hex said, rising and snapping his folder shut. "He's quite disconnected. Thank you, Dalton replied, his hand clamping onto my shoulder. Let's go eat. We have a lot to discuss about the transition. As we moved toward the hallway, I let myself drift a half step behind, just close enough to catch the sharp, hushed exchange Dalton directed at Hext. We need to expedite the medication increase tonight. The words landed like a physical blow. The poisoning wasn't being managed anymore. It was being accelerated towards something final. Somewhere down the corridor dining room, silver clinked against crystal, a hollow metallic tolling. I looked at that dinner table gleaming with silver and cut glass and understood that for Dalton, this was no family meal. It was a last supper. Walls in a luxury home are engineered to insulate, but no grade of drywall can muffle the raw, jagged terror in a daughter's voice. I had excused myself from the table, citing a sudden wave of exhaustion, and instead stood pressed into the shadows of the darkened hallway outside the service pantry, moving with the slow, deliberate care of a man who had memorized every sensor zone in the house. Through the cracked pantry door, I watched Dalton and Nadia return to the kitchen after seeing Hext out. The polished veneer of that golden power couple dissolved in front of me. Dalton's voice dropped to a low, vibrating growl, a register I had never once heard him use in public scraped clean of every hedge fund charm and false sympathy. "You're getting soft, Nadia," he hissed. The heavy kitchen door shuttered closed behind them. "I saw your hand shaking when you poured his tea." Then Dalton revealed something that turned my stomach cold. He had been secretly recording Nadia's confessions of guilt as insurance against her proof that he had never intended her to be a partner, only a fall guy for the day his architecture of lies gave way. "He's my father, Dalton." Her voice came back shimmering and distorted, off the stainless steel of the refrigerator, a ghost of a sound. "He looks so small. Are we really doing this? I'm raising a daughter." But he had already turned her into a ghost. His anger wasn't an eruption. It was a slow-acting acid dissolving her layer by layer until nothing remained but a hollow shell of the girl I used to walk to school. Dalton pinned her against the counter, and I heard the sharp, violent clink of a glass slammed onto the marble. He laid it all out, the dangerous people expecting their money, by Friday, her name on every fraudulent withdrawal from my accounts. He dressed up my death as her only road to staying out of prison and keeping her children. "If we stop now, the bank takes the house on Monday and the SEC takes me on Tuesday," he said. "Where do you think that leaves you and the kids? How do you save someone who is clutching the very hand that is strangling them?" "Please!" She begged, something inside her, visibly snapping. "Don't hurt him anymore. Just let the doctor handle the papers." Dalton laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a grave. He mentioned a boating trip for the weekend, the same method he had used to kill Dorothea Alcott, and I understood then that my execution date had been set. 48 hours. A surge of paternal rage rose through me like groundwater. Through a cracked foundation, I would have to destroy my own daughter's marriage to pull her back from the edge of this actuary of murder. I watched her through the gap as she crumpled into a chair, shoulders heaving with silent, broken sobs that smelled of cold coffee and floor wax. She was a hostage to her own vanity and his malice. Then came the sharp, rhythmic whistling as Dalton walked away, a tune I recognized with a shiver from Vivian's funeral. The sound of Nadia's spirit breaking was quieter than I had expected. But as his footsteps faded, I knew the clock hadn't just started. It was about to strike midnight. I remained in the dark, my heart a heavy stone of resolve, knowing the river was calling for me once again. The soft creak of the studio door and the smell of oil paints and despair followed me as I stepped into my daughter's private sanctuary. Walking into Nadia's studio was like entering a cathedral of denial, every swatch of silk and square of marble tile, a prayer designed to drown out the sound of her own conscience. I found her frantically rearranging mood boards, her movements jerky and desperate, as though she could physically reassemble a world that was caving in around her. And I saw it. Then she hadn't merely been spending the money. She had been funneled into a silent partnership in a shell company that Gideon Stroud used for money laundering, a rot deeper than anything I had allowed myself to imagine. I set aside the agitated persona Dalton expected and spoke plainly. "I know you're in there, Nadia," I said, my voice cutting through the clinical stillness. "Not the designer, not the accomplice, my daughter." She flinched, both hands clutching a fabric swatch like it was the only solid thing left in the room. "Dad, please. Dalton said you'd get like this. You need your medicine." I ignored the tea tray and the luxury surfaces surrounding us, the gold fixtures and fine finishes that were nothing but the bars of her own prison. I know about the $250,000 debt you personally signed for, and the forgery at the hospital. I was trying to shore up a load-bearing wall that termites of her own making had already reduced to sawdust. Grace isn't about what you deserve, Nadia. It's about what you choose to protect now. Help me save Sawyer and Celia, and I will forgive it all. I will protect you from the police, but only if you help me expose him. It's too late. The words came out wet, gasping, filling all the space between us. The papers are already filed. I'm part of it, Dad. I'm the one who signed. The mirror didn't lie. She saw a criminal. I saw my little girl drowning in a sea of gold-plated lies. She caught her own reflection in the large silver-framed mirror and recoiled the distortion of her face in the polished surface, a perfect match for the ruin in her heart. "Could you truly forgive a mistake this big?" She asked, her voice a fragile reed. "I already have," I replied, my heart breaking for the legacy we had lost. "But the law won't." I stood among her expensive samples, a silent witness to her collapse. She didn't choose the light. She chose the fear. Nadia fled the studio, sobbing into her hands, leaving me alone with the rhythmic ticking of the minimalist clock on the wall. As she ran out, a single document fluttered from her desk and settled at my feet. I picked it up, expecting another invoice or a design specification, but it was a boating trip itinerary. My eyes locked onto the departure time, printed in bold 5:00 p.m. Not this weekend. Today. The realization struck me with the force of a structural collapse. Before we go any further, I need you to understand what was truly at stake in that room, and what I was only beginning to grasp about the man standing in front of me. Everything I thought I knew was about to be turned inside out. So, let me ask you this. If you suspected someone close to you was working against you in the shadows, would you confront them head-on, or quietly collect your evidence and wait for the right moment? I glanced at the studio clock. 9:30 already. Less than 8 hours left to live. Dalton had mapped out the boating trip as his primary method, the same instrument of death he'd used on Dorothea Alcott. But the moment we walked into the precinct, he understood the timetable had collapsed on itself. The GPS tracker buried in Vivian's ring had given away our position, forcing him to scrap the slow, deliberate drowning in favor of something rawer: hostages. The children were never written into his original blueprint. They were his emergency exit, the route he bolted toward when the architecture of his deceptions started buckling. The silent house around me had stopped feeling like a cage. It felt like a tomb being mortared shut in real time. I had to move, right now, before the tide of Dalton's endgame swallowed the last pillar my family was standing on. 8 hours left, and my survival was balanced on a sliver of plastic the size of my thumbnail and the nerve of a boy who should never have needed to know how to conceal evidence from his own father. I was alone in the studio, the clock's rhythmic ticking driving against my skull like a mallet when I heard the frantic hollow slap of Sawyer's sneakers on the hardwood. He slipped into the room, breathless and pale, his small hands shaking as he dug into his pocket. He pressed a ruggedized USB drive into my palm. "I found it. Grandpa," he whispered, the smell of damp drywall and dust still caught in his hair. It had been tucked inside a hollowed-out book in the office. The emails. They had been mapping out the boating excursion since before the river. A wave of fierce protective love surged through me, alongside a cold and calculated fury. "You did well, Sawyer. Now listen. If they take me today, you have to find a way to get this to Teo Navarro." I drew my hidden tablet from the drafting kit. The screen's blue flicker cut through the shadows as I scanned what was on the drive. My chest tightened as I scrolled through legal drafts bearing Gideon Stroud's name. This was not merely malpractice. The drive exposed that Gideon Stroud is Dalton's biological brother, making this a predatory family conspiracy from the ground up. They had mapped out a systematic stripping of my architectural legacy, including a fraudulent agreement to hand my firm to an offshore entity. The emails confirmed that Dalton intended to settle a high-interest debt to investors by cashing in on my death. "It's a systematic dismantling," I muttered. "They have already spent my life twice over. How many gigabytes does it take to document the full betrayal of a father? Not many, as it turns out." The vibration of the SUV rolling into the driveway reached me, then tires grinding against gravel. I knew I couldn't carry the drive on my person during the evaluation or the trip. My eyes moved to the structural metal beam set into the studio wall. "Quick, Sawyer, under the load-bearing header," I hissed. "They will never check the structure." Together, we wedged the drive behind the beam with a magnetic strip It felt like holding a live grenade, enough destructive force to level Dalton's entire empire, but only if I could stay alive long enough to pull the pin. As I stepped back, a final notification on the tablet turned my blood to ice. Dalton had planted a GPS tracker inside my wedding ring, the very ring Nadia had taken for safekeeping earlier. They weren't just surveilling my mind, they were charting every step I took through the one thing I had left of Vivienne. The house was no longer a home. It was a sensory-mapped cage where even my grief had been turned into a weapon against me. I fumbled to shut down the tablet, fingers slipping on the glass as footsteps closed in on the door. The studio handle turned, the heavy mahogany groaning, as though it were trying to warn me, and I realized I was still holding the tablet in plain sight. A widening wedge of hall light pushed into the room, threatening to lay bare the last of my secrets. I drove the device under a pile of silk swatches, heart hammering against my ribs, and wheeled to face the door just as the latch clicked open. I shoved the tablet beneath a stack of old blueprints, a heartbeat. Before the door flew wide, my pulse beating against my ribs like a caged bird catching the cat's shadow. Dalton filled the doorway, his tailored silhouette swallowing the hall light behind him. His eyes, cold, restless, swept the room in a surgical pass, hunting for Sawyer or any stray thread of evidence. "You're wandering again, Royce," he said, his voice carrying that smooth hedge fund arrogance I had come to loathe. "This isn't your room?" I let my jaw go slack, settling into the vacant mask of a drifting old man. "The headers, they're steel, aren't they?" I rambled, gesturing toward the load-bearing beam where the drive was hidden. "Good for the weight, very good for the weight." He sneered, reading the air in the room, as though he could taste my panic. Just then, the phone Sawyer had secretly recharged buzzed in my pocket. The call from Detective Rafferty wasn't just about the railing. Teo Navarro had actually captured the push on his phone, but had been too frightened to come forward until he spotted Dalton's SUV again. The phone's vibration felt like a lightning strike in a room built of dry timber, dangerous, unexpected, and the only thing capable of clearing the air. I pulled it out on cold, slick fingers and answered. "Mr. Callahan, this is Detective Rafferty. We found traces of acid on the bolts. We need to talk." Detective Rafferty's voice was like seasoned oak rough solid, carrying the weight of 20 years spent in the darkest corners of this city's history. My heart surged, but I saw Dalton drifting toward the doorway, shoulder against the frame, positioning himself to listen. "Yes," I croaked, keeping my tone vague and muddled. "I remember the water. It was so cold. Have you ever held a conversation knowing that every word you spoke was another brick laid in the wall of your own defense?" I could feel Dalton's predatory attention on my back, like a physical weight. I needed to arrange a meeting without letting him suspect I was anything but lost. "Tomorrow at 9:00. I asked the detective, pitching it to sound like I was talking to an architect. "Yes, the blueprints. I'll be there." I ended the call, my hand trembling as I turned to face my son-in-law. "Who was that Royce?" Dalton asked, his voice a low, resonant threat. "You shouldn't be taking calls alone." "Just a man asking about the blueprints," I replied, looking past him. "He said the railing was broken." I noticed then what he held in his left hand, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. The smell of metal and machine oil from the tool flooded the small space. Sharp, industrial, a scent that announced his intention to destroy whatever structural evidence remained, or perhaps to silence the man who knew too much. He said nothing more, but slowly tapped the steel jaws of the bolt cutters against the door frame, a rhythmic clack like a judge's gavel. His eyes made a promise I would never reach that 9:00 appointment. The shadow of his frame stretched across the floor toward me like a dark tide. I held my ground, cold sweat slicking my phone's casing, certain now that the final structural failure of our family was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. Reading the truth of how my daughter had been hunted wasn't like reading a diary. It was like reviewing the stress tests for a building engineered from the start to collapse with her inside. I retreated to the dimmest corner of my attic room. The tablet's blue light seared into my exhausted eyes, while the cooling fan whirred its frantic mechanical prayer. I opened the file labeled Project L on the flash drive Sawyer had pulled from the office. It was a chillingly methodical timeline, beginning in 2018, cataloging Nadia's deepest insecurities, her preferred luxury brands, and the raw, ragged grief she carried over Vivienne. Dalton had recorded precisely when to offer emotional comfort, and precisely when to introduce the seductive pull of offshore investments. Every romantic milestone in their marriage was a calculated financial maneuver. Target demonstrates high attachment to status symbols. I read a cold grease spreading across my palm. Use debt to ensure compliance. He was never her husband. He was her warden. His words had worked through our family, the way termites work through timber, quiet, unseen, wholly committed to reducing everything we'd built to powder. I discovered that Dalton was the anonymous tipster who had reported my architectural firm for a minor building code violation in 2019, done deliberately to plant the first seed of doubt in my professional record, a hairline crack in the foundation he intended to split wide open. The file detailed his campaign to drive a wedge between Nadia and her old friends, and between Nadia and me, manufacturing misunderstandings, letting calls go unanswered, seeding the belief that I had been losing my mind long before the river incident ever happened. He engineered a choice between her pride and her father, and he rigged it so pride won every single time. The chemical reek of paint in that cramped room seemed to grow denser with every line I scrolled through. The final entries laid out the Royce Callahan liquidation in cold arithmetic. Dalton had mapped the exact date his hedge fund's debt would go public and penciled in my accidental death for 3 days before that. How do you keep breathing when you understand that the man tucking your grandchildren into bed has already calculated the price of their silence? The journal closed on a single chilling line about Sawyer and Celia. They were to be handed off to a boarding facility under Gideon Stroud's name the moment the insurance settled. He intended to sell my grandchildren to cover his own wreckage. The thudding of my own pulse filled my ears as I opened the last digital folder. Inside was a copy of a letter Dalton had written to be discovered. After my death, a forged suicide note laying my choice to end my life in the river at the feet of my unbearable dementia. A flawless forgery of my signature. A final professional insult from a man who treated people as raw construction material. Cold sweat slicked my skin, and nausea climbed my throat as the full systematic shape of his grooming settled over me. I wasn't merely a victim. I was a line item being crossed off a ledger. I sat staring at that forged note on the screen, my own signature perfectly replicated at the bottom, and then I heard the heavy, deliberate footfall of Dalton's shoes halt directly outside my door. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, a shadow filling the threshold, and I understood that the blueprints for the final confrontation were already in his hands. The gray, soupy light of a Savannah dawn seeped through the attic window, and the rasp of a zipper on a duffel bag somewhere below told me the final phase had begun. I drove the tablet deep into my waistband, the cold edge of it pressed against my skin, a sharp reminder of everything I was carrying. Dalton steered me toward the SUV with a buoyant, almost festive energy that made my flesh crawl. He narrated the boating trip as though it were a well-earned reward for my recovery rather than a premeditated execution. Nadia stood at the driver's side, her hands clenched around the door handle so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Dalton leaned close, his voice layered with that hollow, rehearsed warmth. "Drive carefully. Keep Dad comfortable. I'll meet you at the marina in 20. I have him, Dalton. Just go." She whispered it, her eyes red-rimmed and emptied out. I noticed then that she had already packed an escape bag for herself and the children weeks earlier, buried under a spare tire cover, proof that some part of her had long been bracing for Dalton's slide toward violence. The smell of leather and expensive perfume inside the SUV was suffocating as we backed out of the drive. In the rearview mirror, I watched Dalton standing alongside Gideon Stroud, the two of them tracking our departure. For several miles, the only sound was the rhythmic click of the turn signal. Then, as the Eugene Talmadge Memorial Bridge began to vibrate up through the tires, I let the mask drop. "I know about the note, Nadia," I said, my voice level and clear. "He wrote a suicide note in my handwriting. He was never going to let you keep the children." She gasped and nearly pulled into the adjacent lane as sunlight blazed off the harbor water in a blinding sheet. The Eugene Talmadge Memorial Bridge felt like a tightrope strung over an abyss, and Nadia was the one swaying while I held the only safety line that remained. "Daddy, I'm so sorry," she sobbed, her rapid, shallow breathing filling the cabin. "I didn't know I thought it was just the money. I saw the kerosene receipt, but I was too frightened." I reached across and covered her hand with mine on the steering wheel. "Grace isn't about what you deserve, Nadia. It's about what you choose to protect right now. He has a GPS tracker in my wedding ring. He's watching us this very moment. What does a lifelong lie sound like when it finally snaps? Quieter than you'd expect. It sounds like a turn signal clicking in the dark. As we cleared the far end of the bridge, her phone buzzed with a text from Dalton. She didn't glance at it. "Turn the wheel, Nadia," I told her. "End this structure before it destroys us all." With a hard, wrenching yank, she swung the SUV toward the downtown precinct exit. "I'll tell them everything," she breathed, "even the parts that send me to jail." As we rolled into the police station lot, a grim wave of relief moved through me. Teo Navarro's truck was already sitting near the entrance the swimmer had arrived to deliver his video evidence of the push. Nadia cut the engine and pressed her forehead to the wheel, her whole body shaking under the weight of what she'd just chosen. "He's going to kill me for this, isn't he?" she asked, her voice a hollow whisper that finished breaking what was left of my heart. But before I could answer, my phone shuddered with a violence that jolted through my whole body. An unknown number blazed across the cracked screen. My thumb hung over decline, but something in an architect's ingrained instinct for structural failure made me pick up instead. The voice that filled my ear wasn't Dalton's polished hedge fund charm. It was the raw, stripped sound of a man watching his empire come apart in real time, searching for someone to bury beneath the rubble. "Hello, Royce," Dalton said, his voice a low, vibrating threat that lifted every hair on my arms. "I hear you've been having conversations with people who don't understand our family's business." The cold, metallic taste of fear flooded my mouth. He knew we were at the precinct. The GPS tracker and Vivian's wedding ring had given us away. I could hear traffic moving in the background, the unmistakable whoosh of Highway 17, and I knew he wasn't at the marina. He was mobile, hunting. "Dalton," I said, holding my voice steady against the hammering of my pulse. "If you're calling to apologize for the river, you're a few weeks late." His laugh was a dry, rattling sound that carried no warmth at all. "Apologize, no, Royce. I'm calling to offer you a choice. You can shut this investigation down, or you can keep playing detective, and we'll see how well you swim when the current runs twice as strong." The threat was plain enough, but it was the background noise that turned my blood to ice. A child's voice. Celia's high-pitched giggle. And beneath it, the unmistakable electronic chime of a school bell. "Where are you, Dalton?" I demanded, my voice climbing. His silence was a physical weight against my chest. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Royce. Just remember, foundations crumble fastest when you pull the wrong support beam. Think carefully about which beams you're willing to lose." The line went dead, leaving only the hollow ring of his threat in the air. I looked at Nadia. Every drop of color had drained from her face. "He's at the school," I said. "He's taking the children." We hit the precinct doors at a run, Nadia screaming for Detective Rafferty as I recounted the call. The scent of jasmine from the garden outside mingled with the acrid bite of adrenaline as Rafferty immediately radioed dispatch. That call wasn't merely a threat, it was a declaration of war, and the battlefield was about to widen beyond anything I had prepared for. As sirens began to cut through the distance, I understood that the structure of our family was about to face its final stress test. The precinct smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, a sterile scent that felt like the first clean breath I'd drawn since the river had tried to take me. I walked through the heavy glass doors beside Nadia, the cold, air-conditioned draft of the interview room raising the hair on my arms. Detective Rafferty met us in a windowless space, his face locked in a grim mask. I didn't waste time on tears. I started with structural proof. I laid the dry cleaning receipt with its telltale river silt on the table, then the symptom log bearing Gideon Stroud's handwritten triggers. Rafferty told me that Teo Navarro's video showed more than the push. It showed Dalton returning to the railing 10 minutes later, carrying a vial of acid to finish dissolving the bolts. "I'm an architect detective. I know how to read a failure," I said, my voice finally steady. "This railing didn't rust. It was assassinated." Rafferty nodded slowly, the scratch of his pen on his legal pad, the only other sound in the room. "You've brought me a lot more than just a bad memory, Mr. Callahan." I reached into my pocket and produced the rugged flash drive. The metallic smell of the evidence bag felt like a kind of victory as I handed it across. I walked him through the email chain between Dalton and Gideon Stroud, the liquidation timeline, and the Predator's journal in all its horror. As the drive was plugged into the workstation, a blue flickering light from the monitor washed over us both. Spreading the evidence across that table felt like sealing the last gap in a flood wall. Dalton's web of deception had nowhere left to run. Every officer in that room went quiet as Rafferty worked through the cold, itemized blueprint for my murder. "It's all here," I breathed. "The life insurance policies, the shell companies, the earlier victims." "Good Lord," Rafferty murmured. The man built a spreadsheet around the probate window. A tech specialist with a close-cropped fade sat nearby, his eyes processing the scrolling data faster than most people read a headline. Agent Kepler lifted the drive with sterile tweezers and set to work authenticating the digital signatures beneath the forged power of attorney. The server fans hummed steadily into the silences between us. When I held up my tablet to show the GPS ping, the atmosphere in the room shifted. That ring is inside this building, which means Dalton already knows we're here, I said. We have to kill that signal. Do it now! Rafferty snapped the order at Kepler, who erupted into motion, working to cut the device off from the network. What is it like, I wondered, to watch your own existence get listed for sale on a dark web marketplace while you're seated in a warm room under fluorescent light? Kepler's hands were a blur across the keyboard. What he pulled from a hidden partition on that drive was worse than anything I'd braced for live stream login credentials, tied to cameras planted throughout my Skidaway Island home. Dalton hadn't been content just to surveil me. He had been feeding footage of my supposed deterioration to a closed circle of predatory lenders running me like a property at auction. Rafferty watched the bedroom feed from Skidaway Island, and the blood left his face entirely. Then his gaze jumped to a second monitor, one plotting the real-time movement of Dalton's car. If tracking you isn't what he's doing right now, he said, his voice dropping as he turned to me, with something close to dread behind his eyes, then why is he parked outside the school? There is no architectural filter for a father who must stand behind glass and watch his only child take herself apart. Sentence by sentence in the pitiless glare of an interrogation room, I pressed my forehead to the cold, slick surface of the observation window. On the far side of that partition, the overhead LEDs stripped every trace of warmth from Nadia's face until she resembled a woman already erased from her own life. Rafferty made the turn from my protector to her examiner without a word. I watched Nadia's hands shake around a plastic cup of water mascara, scoring dark channels down both cheeks. She told him then quietly, as though confessing to a priest, that she had covertly captured one of Dalton's calls with Gideon Stroud, a call in which the two men mapped out what they intended to do with me. She had been sitting on a recording of the murder plot for weeks. She could have brought it forward and spared me everything that followed. She hadn't, because her own terror had paralyzed her. All I wanted was the houseback detective, she said, her voice arriving through the intercom with a strange muffled resonance. Dalton told me it was a short-term draw against Dad's estate. Rafferty's expression didn't shift by a degree. Taking $250,000 from a man who never agreed to it has a name, Nadia. It's called grand larceny. That pane of glass separating us was not merely a material thing. It was 40 years of trust, compressed into something you could press your palm against and still not reach through. When Rafferty pushed the power of attorney across to her, she came apart entirely. She acknowledged she had recognized that the signature wasn't mine. Gideon had persuaded her it was the only way to keep the family from financial ruin. Dalton had not simply preyed on her ambition. He had located the deepest crack in her, her dread of failure, and pried her open with it until she was useful to him. I had no idea what happened at the river. She wailed, the faint ozone bite of the recording equipment threading through her voice. I swear on my children's lives, I believed it was an accident. But when he was trying to speak and the doctors were in that room, Rafferty cut in. You stayed quiet, didn't you? She had no answer. Her gaze dropped to the tabletop and stayed there the way a structure settles when the load finally exceeds what the foundation can bear. How do you extend your hand to someone who borrowed your name to draft your death notice? I ached to push through that glass and reach back through the years to the daughter who used to climb onto my drafting stool and watch me work. That daughter no longer existed. Rafferty told her plainly her willingness to cooperate would be entered into the record, but nothing she said changed the fact that she had made herself part of the conspiracy. The moment the word prison became real to her, her head swung toward the glass, some instinct pulling her gaze straight to where I stood. Daddy, are you there? Please. There was a structural rescue written in her eyes, and I was the one person in the world who couldn't perform it. A uniformed officer was steering her toward the exit. When she stopped, turned back, and pressed her mouth close to Rafferty's ear. Dalton keeps a second car off the books stashed in a rental lot. She told him, her voice scraped hollow. Something he keeps ready for exactly this kind of moment. He'll use it today. Through the one-way glass, her eyes found mine, and the daughter I had spent a lifetime building vanished in that instant, exchanged for a woman confronting the architecture of the cage she'd helped assemble around herself. I stood in the dark and let the weight of it settle over me like a burial cloth. The woman I had shaped my entire life to protect was a stranger now, staring at a wreckage she had a hand in building. The door fell shut behind Nadia with a thud that rang through me long after the sound was gone, until Rafferty's radio swallowed it with a burst of static, a high-priority school district alert that turned whatever remained of my relief into something cold and edged and spiked. I stood in the command center, breathing ink smell off the freshly printed warrants stacked on the nearest desk. Rafferty's expression was stone as he put his signature on the arrest paperwork for Dalton Stroud and Gideon Stroud. "It's finished, Royce," he said, the words nearly lost under the crossfire of radio traffic around us. "Attempted murder conspiracy, we have what we need." I studied the wet ink on those pages. "Don't let him see the strike team before they're on top of him," I said. "He thinks in contingencies. He's already mapped every exit off that property." The gears of justice had finally engaged, and then the desk phone rang and the whole mechanism seized. The principal of the Children's Academy was on the line, her voice stretched thin by panic. Dalton had walked through the school's front doors 20 minutes earlier with a story about a massive stroke that had just felled me. He needed to collect Sawyer and Celia immediately, he'd said. Nadia had designated him the only authorized pickup contact. Just 2 days removed from the river, the school had handed my grandchildren over without a moment's hesitation. "He has them," I heard myself shout it, cold sweat sliding down the back of my neck. "Mr. Callahan, I'm right here in front of you. Breathe," Rafferty said, though his jaw was locked tight. "His vehicle is on our radar." Those warrants had been walls of paper, and Dalton had driven straight through them. When I checked the home's safe, the passports were gone. He had been engineering this exit for weeks. A dense, localized quiet descended over the command center as the tech specialist directed everyone's attention to the monitors. The GPS beacon in the wedding ring showed Dalton's vehicle sitting motionless outside a downtown shopping mall. He'd shed the tracker like dead weight. The state line wasn't his next move. He was resetting the board. Do you know what fear actually feels like when it arrives at full force? It is an ice water surge straight into the base of your spine the instant you understand that your grandchildren are being held by someone who regards them as leverage. "He's not running, detective," I managed, my voice fracturing. "He's taking hostages." My own blood, the children I read to and carried on my shoulders, reduced to a structural shield. Every television screen in the precinct snapped to the emergency broadcast at the same moment, a synchronized flare of light that seemed to compress the walls inward. There, framed under the block, red letters of the Amber Alert, were Sawyer and Celia. School portraits, gap-toothed smiles, the ordinary beauty of children who had no idea. I couldn't look away from their faces. The command center went absolutely still, every officer in the room absorbing the same realization. The man we had been closing in on had just converted those two children into his insurance policy. The overhead fluorescent stuttered and strobed, and in that pulsing light I kept seeing Nadia's face locked in a loop of screaming that no sum of money and no catalog of lies had ever been able to prevent from arriving. She went down in the middle of the squad room, her heels finding no purchase on the linoleum, wailing for her children in great ragged rhythmic heaves that gutted the professional calm of everyone within earshot. "I handed them to him." She shrieked, the grief and self-hatred tangled together beyond any clean separation. "My signature is on the form that walked them out the door." Rafferty stepped in to steady her, his face locked into the practiced blankness of a man who has seen this before. "Nadia, eyes on me." He said, his voice a blade cutting through the noise. "Give me the plate on that rental vehicle. Right now." I stood apart from it watching, and I understood with absolute certainty that my daughter had finally fully broken. The tragedy was that the truth had only reached her by destroying the two people she had been trying to protect all along. The precinct entrance slid open, and a bike courier pushed through spandex damp, with effort blinking at the chaos surrounding him. He was carrying a package for the architect. Rafferty pulled him aside and took it. Inside a folded blueprint of the Skidaway Island property, nestled like a message designed to reach only me, was Sawyer's digital watch, the face smashed, the hand stopped at 3:00 p.m. The smell of blood on the glass reached me before Rafferty had fully unwrapped it. "He wants me to feel this," I whispered, my pulse hammering. When Rafferty angled the watch face toward the light, a small, bloody print emerged near the edge. It was too small to belong to Sawyer. It was Celia's. My brave little girl had fought back. But it was the soft electronic chime of an iPad notification that cut through the noise like a bell in a cathedral. Agent Kepler's head snapped up from his workstation, eyes widening as he stared at the tracking software. "We've got something," he said, voice sharp with urgency. "It's coming from a cellular-enabled iPad registered to Celia Stroud." Every sound in the room dropped away, except for the server hum and the distant murmur of police radios. I shouldered through the cluster of officers' heart-hammering and leaned over Kepler's shoulder. "What does it say?" Kepler's fingers moved fast across the keyboard, pulling the notification onto the main screen. It wasn't a standard message, it was a location pin dropped inside the Find My Friends app, the kind of breadcrumb a sharp child leaves when she knows her phone has already been confiscated. Attached was a single line of text, typed with deliberate care: Marsh Hawk, Motor Lodge, Highway 17, North Room 14. The message was time-stamped 3 minutes ago, and below it sat a second line that drained the warmth straight out of me. "Grandpa, he has a knife." "Please hurry! That's my girl!" I whispered, my voice fracturing somewhere between pride and pure terror. "She's telling us exactly where they are." Rafferty was already on his radio, voice hard and commanding. "All units, we have a confirmed location. Marsh Hawk, Motor Lodge. Highway 17. North Room 14. Suspect is armed with a blade holding 2 juvenile hostages. Code 3 response, but hold sirens within a half mile. I need SWAT mobilized now. Keep the perimeter tight." The room erupted into motion, but I stood rooted. The Marsh Hawk Motor Lodge was a leftover from Savannah's past, a 2-story roadside relic teetering on the edge of condemnation. My firm had evaluated its structural integrity back in the 90s. The place was a ruin of rotting timber and failing load-bearing supports, and Dalton had chosen it for precisely that reason. "How long until SWAT arrives?" I asked. Kepler checked his screen. 12 minutes, sir. Maybe 15 with traffic." 12 minutes was a lifetime for 2 children penned in a room with a man who had already decided killing was an acceptable outcome. I turned to Rafferty, something hardening behind my sternum. "I'm going with you, and I'm walking in first." Rafferty started to push back, but I cut him off before the words formed. "He knows me, detective. You send a badge through that door and he panics. But if I'm the one he sees, he'll believe he still has the upper hand." Rafferty held my gaze for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "You wear a vest and you follow my lead. The instant I signal, you go flat on that floor. Are we clear?" As we moved toward the parking lot, I looked at Celia's message one final time. She had handed me the blueprint. What remained was the execution. The Marsh Hawk Motor Lodge wasn't any kind of landmark. It was more like a headstone marking the slow death of Savannah's roadside era. 2 peeling stories, a neon sign stuttering like something in its final hours, paint curling off the facade in long dry strips. When Rafferty's cruiser ground to a stop in the gravel lot, the smell of hot asphalt and marsh salt rolled in together. I climbed out the bulletproof vest, pressing against my ribs like a second skeleton, and fixed my eyes on the second-floor walkway, where room 14 sat like a shuttered, unblinking eye. The whole structure was decay made visible, rusted railings, cracked concrete windows, sealed behind sun-bleached curtains. It was exactly the kind of place a cornered man retreats to for his last move. SWAT had already wrapped a perimeter around the building, dark figures sliding into place behind vehicles and along the exterior stairwell, with the quiet efficiency of people who do this for a living. Rafferty put a hand on my shoulder. "He's in room 14, second floor, northeast corner. Curtains are drawn, no visible movement, but thermal is reading 3 signatures, 2 small, 1 adult." The relief that my grandchildren were breathing was immediately flattened by the knowledge of what Dalton was capable of when the walls closed in. How do you reason with a man who has spent years treating human beings as entries in a ledger? Rafferty's radio broke the silence. "All units in position. Snipers on the adjacent roofline have a sight line to the window, but the children's proximity makes a shot unacceptable. We go with contact and negotiation." Rafferty looked at me. "This is your moment. Walk up, knock, keep him engaged. The second that knife drops, or he steps away from the kids we breach. But the moment he makes a move toward you, floor." I tugged at the vest and felt the concealed wire taped beneath it. The microphone cold and small against my skin, channeling every syllable to the team stationed outside. Then I started across the parking lot, gravel popping under each step. The afternoon sun hammered down off the metal railings. I took the stairs slowly, each tread groaning under my weight, and past cigarette butts pressed into corners, a child's toy abandoned near room 12, the mingled odor of mildew and cheap cleaning solution. When I reached the walkway and faced that door, faded teal paint, a tarnished brass number hanging at an angle, I stopped, drew one breath. Behind the wall, a television was running a news anchor describing the Amber Alert alongside photos of my grandchildren. "Dalton," I said, keeping my voice level in spite of everything surging through me. "It's Royce. I came alone. No weapons, no police. I only want to talk." The silence that followed had physical mass. Then the deadbolt clicked back and the door opened a crack. Dalton's face appeared in the gap, and I barely knew him. The high-end cycling kit was gone, traded for a sweat-soaked shirt, gone limp at the collar. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, the composed operator I had spent months fearing reduced to something hollow and unraveling. "You shouldn't have come, Royce," he said under his breath. "This could have wound down quietly. Now you're just making it worse." Past his shoulder, I caught a glimpse of Sawyer and Celia on the far bed, faces drained white. Every structural layer of my resolve locked into place the moment my eyes met theirs. Whatever came through the door next, I would not allow this man to take them. The room was a sealed container of desperation, stale smoke, fear, sweat, a trapped stillness that pressed against the skin. I stepped inside my attention, going straight to Sawyer and Celia on the far bed. They were alive. The terror in their eyes was a blade turning slowly in my chest. Dalton shut the door behind me, the deadbolt sliding home, with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The room matched what I'd expected, two sagging beds under faded floral spreads, a battered nightstand, a small table near the window, where Dalton had arranged his version of a command post. His laptop was open to live news coverage. Next to it, a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade caught the fluorescent light and held it. "Don't move, Grandpa," Sawyer whispered. "He has the knife." I raised both hands slowly, palms forward. The wire against my chest was live, every word flowing out to Rafferty's team waiting below. "I'm not here to fight you, Dalton. I came because once you called me down to the river, and now I'm calling you back to dry ground." Dalton's laugh came out bitter and scraped clean of anything real. "There's nothing left to end Royce. It's already over. Everything's gone. Gideon is gone. Nadia's testimony leveled what remained. The only thing I'm holding on to is leverage." He moved the knife toward the children, the blade catching the light in a way that made my stomach drop. I took one measured step closer, angling myself into the space between Dalton and the kids. The floorboards complained beneath me, a reminder that this structure, the building and the standoff, both was close to giving way entirely. "You think those children are leverage?" I kept it conversational, kept it easy. "And Dalton, they're your stepchildren. You read them bedtime stories, you sat through their school plays. You must have felt something at some point." His face contorted. "I felt bored, Royce. Like I was running a daycare for someone else's baggage while the clock ran down on the payout. Do you have any idea what it costs to smile at a child, when what you're really seeing is a decimal point?" The casual savagery of it landed like a fist, but I held my expression steady. I needed him talking. Through the curtain's gap, I caught the outline of a dark-clad figure pressing along the exterior walkway, SWAT edging into position, though the room's configuration made a clear angle impossible. Dalton was standing too close to the window. "You're right, Dalton. I miscalculated you. Dorothea, Beverly, even myself. You build things same as I do. You just work with different materials." His eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you win. You want leverage, then take me instead. Let the children walk, and I'll be the one in that room. I'm worth far more to you alive than they are. Sign whatever you need, I'll put my name on it. Just let them go." For a fraction of a second, something calculating moved behind his eyes. Then Sawyer's voice came through young and clear and devastating. "Don't believe him, Dalton. Grandpa's wearing a wire. The police are right outside." My blood went to ice. Dalton's gaze snapped to my chest, his eyes widening as the pieces connected. The boy had just pulled the pin on the entire negotiation. Dalton's face collapsed into fury as he lunged forward. Knife raised, and the careful architecture of the standoff came apart all at once. Outside, Rafferty's voice broke over the megaphone. "Dalton Stroud, this is Savannah Police. Release the hostages and surrender. You are surrounded." Boots hammered up the exterior stairs, and I understood that the breach was already in motion, ready or not. The fluorescent bulb flickered, throwing broken shadows across the walls, and in that stuttering light, Dalton's eyes locked onto mine with a terrible final clarity. He had no intention of surrendering. He meant to take down whatever he could reach. Time didn't slow. It shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Dalton's lunge came as a blur, the hunting knife carving through stale air with lethal purpose. I threw myself backward, shoulder crashing into the cheap dresser, as the blade sang past my face, close enough that I felt the displaced air against my cheek. Behind me, Celia screamed high and piercing, freezing Dalton for a single heartbeat. That heartbeat was all Sawyer needed. The boy launched from the bed, slamming into Dalton's legs in a desperate tackle that sent him stumbling sideways. The knife clattered away, skittering under the bed. And then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the splintering crack of the door blown clean off its hinges. Breach, breach, breach! SWAT poured in like a black tide boots hammering the floor. Flash grenades erupted in blinding light and concussive force that rattled every tooth in my skull. I dropped flat, covering my head, as the room dissolved into chaos, barked commands, acrid smoke, a world coming apart at its seams. Get down. On the ground, hands where we can see them. Dalton's scream of fury was cut short as officers drove him into the carpet, their combined weight pinning him. Zip ties ratcheted tight. Then Rafferty's voice steady above the noise. Secure the suspect. Get the children out. Clear the room. Strong hands hauled me upright and steered me toward the door. Through the smoke, I could see Sawyer and Celia being carried out by officers wrapped in protective arms. Grandpa Celia's voice cutting through everything. I am here, sweetheart, I called back, voice breaking apart. You're safe now. They guided me out onto the walkway, and the afternoon sun hit like a physical blow. The parking lot below was a sea of flashing lights, patrol cars, ambulances, fire trucks, all converging on this roadside pocket, where our darkest chapter had finally met its end. Behind me, Dalton's voice raw and stripped to nothing. You don't understand, he screamed as they dragged him out. I needed that money. The fund was collapsing. I had no choice. Rafferty materialized at my side, hand gripping my shoulder. You had a choice, Dalton. You chose to be a predator. Now you live with the consequences. As Dalton was hauled down the stairs, I caught one last look at his face. The polished manager, the charming son-in-law, the man who'd stood beaming at my daughter's wedding, all of it gone. What remained was a hollow shell, a structure rotten from the foundation up. Medics swarmed Sawyer and Celia while I stood on the walkway, legs barely holding. Rafferty guided me to sit on the top step, the metal railing cool against my palm. You did good, Royce. Kept him talking long enough for us to get into position. If you hadn't walked through that door, this ends differently. I looked down at the parking lot where Dalton was being loaded into a patrol car, wrists bound. The hunting knife had been bagged, as evidence blade still gleaming under the afternoon light. I thought about Dorothea and Beverly names, reduced to line items on a ledger. I thought about the river and the push, and I thought about 2 children in that ambulance alive, because a 12-year-old had been brave enough to throw himself at a monster. Nadia arrived moments later, her car screeching to a stop at the perimeter. She ran toward the ambulance, face torn between anguish and relief, gathering Sawyer and Celia into her arms. I watched her collapse to her knees, sobbing into their hair, and I understood that whatever trials still lay ahead, this reunion was the first honest thing she'd done in years. As the sun tilted toward the horizon, I made my way down the stairs. Each step felt weighted, the full press of everything bearing down on me. But when I reached the bottom and felt solid ground underfoot, I understood I was still standing. The structure of my life had been tested, cracked, nearly brought down, but the foundation had held. They say justice is blind, but as I walked into that courtroom, I found she was also cold, efficient, and entirely unmoved by the fact that she was dismantling whatever remained of my family. I stepped into Chatham County Courthouse, air thick with floor wax and old paper footsteps bouncing off high ceilings. Morning light filtered through tall windows, throwing geometric shadows across polished marble. Judge Ashcroft sat behind the bench like a gargoyle of the law, eyes weathered by decades of seeing this city's worst. I took my seat in the front row as Dalton Stroud was led in, stripped of designer suits and every inch of his swagger. He wore standard orange that looked like a structural defect against the mahogany paneling behind him. The prosecution laid out the Predator's journal and Sawyer's recordings, building the portrait of a man who treated homicide as a line-item expense, They detailed Dorothea Alcott's boating accident, Beverly Crane's drowning, and the meticulous planning behind my attempted murder. The courtroom went utterly silent as they played the audio of Dalton's motel confession. I did what was necessary for the fund. "You don't build a legacy, Mr. Stroud," Judge Ashcroft said, voice a low, gravelly vibration. "You build a cemetery." Dalton refused to look at me, jaw locked in a final posture of arrogance. The sharp crack of the gavel landed like a demolition ball. Life without the possibility of parole. The second trial followed immediately, cutting deeper. Gideon Stroud, Dalton's biological brother and co-conspirator, was led in wearing chains. The corrupt lawyer had been apprehended at Atlanta Airport, attempting to board a flight to the Caymans with $3 million in cryptocurrency. His arrest had been Swift Rafferty's coordination with federal marshals. Gideon's face was resigned as the charges were read: conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse fraud, money laundering obstruction. The evidence was overwhelming: forged power of attorney shell companies, notarized documents that had nearly stripped me of everything. He didn't fight. He simply sat while his attorney negotiated a plea deal in exchange for testimony against Dalton. 15 years, Judge Ashcroft announced, gavel striking. No parole eligibility for the first 10. As Gideon was led away, he glanced across at me. What I saw wasn't remorse, it was cold acknowledgement that he'd been outplayed. The prosecution also brought charges against Dr. Burrell, Hex, the cognitive consultant Dalton had paid to fabricate my incompetency evaluation. Hext's medical license was permanently revoked by the Georgia Board of Medical Examiners, and he received a 3-year suspended sentence for professional misconduct and conspiracy to commit fraud. The sapphire bezel watch he'd worn Dalton's hedge fund merchandise was entered into evidence as proof of their financial relationship. Justice, it seemed, had a long memory for those who turned medicine into a weapon against the vulnerable. The mood shifted to profound tragedy when Nadia took the stand. She looked hollowed-out designer clothes, replaced by a simple gray dress face bare of makeup. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy, grand larceny, elder abuse, her voice barely a whisper as she laid out her role. "I wanted the life he promised. I didn't care who I had to step on, even my own father. I sat and watched my daughter accept responsibility for crimes that would cost her 7 years, and I felt the weight of every parental decision I had ever made pressing down on my chest. Despite her cooperation, her testimony helping secure Dalton's conviction, her role at the motel, the full scale of it was too great to set aside." 7 years, Judge Ashcroft said, voice softening fractionally, with credit for time served and the possibility of parole after 5 contingent on demonstrated rehabilitation. I watched her being handcuffed, the silver bracelets a cruel echo of the designer watches she'd once coveted. As she was let out, she turned one last time. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she mouthed, tears running freely. I nodded, unable to find a single word. After adjournment, Rafferty handed me a heavy folder containing court-ordered restitution and the Skidaway Island estate dissolution. I was granted full permanent guardianship of Sawyer and Celia, the beginning of a different architectural project, entirely one requiring patience, love, and a foundation built on honesty rather than gold. "They're safe now," Royce Rafferty said on the courthouse steps, "but they're going to need shoring up." I looked at the folder, then at the empty space where my daughter had stood, and understood that the hardest part of being an architect wasn't the building. It was knowing which parts of a ruin were still worth saving. I spent that morning checking the railings on the back porch, not because I doubted the wood, but because verifying every support beam had become the only way I knew how to breathe. 6 months had passed since the trials, 6 months of learning to be a full-time guardian while carrying the weight of a daughter locked behind bars. The visiting room at Pulaski State Prison smelled of industrial cleaner and quiet despair. I sat at a small metal table, hands folded, waiting for the guard to bring Nadia out. Sawyer and Celia sat beside me, their young faces tight. "It's okay to be nervous," I told them softly. "She's going to look different, but she's still your mom." The door buzzed open and Nadia walked in. The transformation was structural designer labels, gone, replaced by a standard beige uniform. Her hair was pulled back, face bare, eyes carrying a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "Daddy," she whispered, voice coming apart. "I didn't think you'd come." Sawyer and Celia launched themselves at the plexiglass barrier, palms pressed flat against the surface. "Mom, we missed you." Nadia pressed her own hands to the glass, matching their small palms with hers. I missed you too, babies, every single day. The guard permitted a brief contact visit, a privilege earned through good behavior. She held Sawyer and Celia with a desperation that said everything 6 months of separation could say. When she finally released them, she turned to face me. I don't know how to start, Dad. I don't even know where to begin with an apology. Forgiveness isn't a fresh coat of paint slapped over rot. Nadia, I told her, holding her hand, it's the slow work of sanding through old layers until you reach the clean wood beneath. She spoke about the forensic accounting degree she'd earned, the therapy she'd committed to the reckoning with the materialism that had left her so exposed. I want to use what happened to help people, Dad. Hunt down the predators before someone else suffers what you did. Nadia drew out a handwritten letter, fingers trembling. She read it aloud, a precise accounting of every choice made, every forged signature, every moment she'd held her tongue when she should have spoken. Not a justification, a confession. When she finished, her eyes found mine directly. I chose the gold over you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving I understand what I lost. I reached into my jacket and produced Vivian's note. Your mother knew Nadia, I said, keeping my voice low. She had seen the darkness behind Dalton's eyes before any of the rest of us could. Nadia unfolded it with shaking hands and read the graceful script. Don't let our daughter lose her way in the shadows. Tears came freely as she pressed the page to her chest. Mom tried to pull me back, she whispered, and I didn't listen. As the guard signaled our time was finished, Sawyer passed his mother a drawing, a sketch of the Jones Street house, with all of us gathered on the porch and a small figure labeled, Mom coming home soon. Nadia clutched it against her heart. I'll be home, and when I am, I'll be the mother you deserve. Walking out into the sharp November light, Celia slipped her hand into mine. Do you think she meant it? Sweetheart. I glanced back at the gray concrete building, then down at her upturned face full of hope. I think she's finally laying a foundation worth standing on. 3 years on, I stood at the water's edge, fingers tracing the cold, reinforced steel of the new railing along the Wilmington River Promenade. A small memorial plaque bore the names of Dorothea and Beverly, the women Dalton had used and discarded like broken scaffolding. The double-bolted supports were exactly what I had specified. You can't stop the tide, but you can sink the pilings deep enough that it doesn't matter. Never let anyone tell you your years have made you weak. Your years are your reinforcement. I thought about what family structure truly means. Sawyer's sharp eye, Celia's quiet resilience. They were the load-bearing beams of a future a predator had tried to bring down. Even Nadia's scars had become part of the foundation now. The oldest buildings are the ones that know how to outlast the storm. I looked out across the Savannah winter sunset, the sky bleeding deep purple. I have signed over the Callahan firm to Sawyer, so the legacy carries on through the boy who spotted the first crack in the wall. Life isn't a finished drawing. It's a constant revision of blueprints right up until the structure can finally stand on its own. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, thank you. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Looking back on everything, the river, the courtroom, the long, quiet nights in between, I won't pretend it didn't cost me. It cost me sleep. It cost me trust. And for a time, it cost me the easy belief that the people gathered around your table are all there for love. But I believe God put Sawyer in that house for a reason. The Lord's timing is not always gentle, but it is always precise. What felt like the worst chapter of my life turned out to be the one that showed me exactly who I could count on, and exactly what the truth is worth when you refuse to let it be buried. These are the things I'd tell any father, any grandfather sitting across from me right now. First, trust is built on consistency, not words. Watch what people do in the quiet moments, not just the ones they perform for the room. Second, if something feels wrong, believe it. Age gives you a finely tuned instinct. Don't let anyone talk you out of your own gut. Third, the children in your life are watching everything. Protect them fiercely and let them protect you too when the time comes. Fourth, love without accountability is not love. It is exposure. Know the difference. I've shared a lot of grandpa revenge stories over the years, stories of men and women who refused to be written off. This is one of the father stories that will stay with me the longest, because it taught me that survival is not just physical. It is knowing down to your bones that you still matter. If any part of this story spoke to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge so you never miss what's coming next. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loved, and never stop standing your ground.